Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. Kamleshan, specific thanks to you for preparing these talks. The series today is our last installment of this mini school. So thank you to everybody that have been present and all the feedback, and we really appreciate the input and the interest. And people aren't here to listen to me, so I hand over to you. Thank you very much. Welcome to everybody here today. Thank you so much. Kamleshan.
Great. Thanks, Renee. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is well. I mentioned last week that this was a two-part webinar, moving on from last week. But for those who have not attended last week, I just have two slides just to recap before we go into the study itself and kind of where I use natural language processing and LLMs, large language models, to try and develop a green bond regulation tool. I'll say at the outset that the findings of it are obviously in its infancy, so there are some findings that I've excluded because they're in the publication that's in press. So I can only share that once it's kind of officially released, but I have kind of put as much as I can that's possible. I think, starting out on trying to develop this tool, I think as most researchers are, I was very hopeful that, you'd get perfect answers and have a really well-functioning model. But, that's obviously the optimist in myself. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. There was a lot of parameterization needed for the model, a lot of imperfect data, a lot of findings about what is currently going on in industry that maybe I knew as a consultant, but was more hopeful about as a researcher. And I hope it gives you a bit of a flavor of maybe how things are being done in industry, not to add to your skepticism of how things maybe are done in the sustainability space, but I hope it maybe gives you some real clarity about some of the issues that we're facing and maybe how we can also make it better. So as Renee mentioned, this is the last presentation in the series. I'm just going to, while we're chatting, just have the chat up just so I don't miss anything like last time. So just give me a second. So this is the fourth paper. And I just want to start off with this recap slide, because I think if you understand the structure, generally you'll understand how green bond regulation is undertaken by a central bank or prudential regulators, and maybe some of the issues that they're facing in trying to benchmark this instrument in comparison to others. And as I mentioned last week, even though there isn't a specific price differential that increases the appetite for green, there is still an investor movement that is trying to focus on these instruments. And with that comes the need to have proper regulation in place so you can distill whether the instrument is actually green or not. So you do not want, as a regulator, you do not want to be incentivizing issuances that do not meet the green bond integrity criteria that you've laid out. You also don't want to be saying that certain instruments are green when they're not. So, I hope you can appreciate some of the issues that the regulators are facing. I will say one additional point that maybe is skimmed over, but a lot of the regulators and central banks do not have specific climate, environmental, ESG, or sustainability expertise. Often these institutions are very much focused on, very specific mandates related to macroeconomic stability, financial stability, interest rate changes, and sustainability and ESG, even though it has become prominent in terms of the World Economic Forum's categorization of prominent risks. The truth is that a lot of the regulators are still a little bit behind in having that in-house expertise. So that also maybe is trying to demonstrate that there is a need for some assistance to the regulators, and this research really came about because of that reason of wanting to try and create something that was more automated. In reality, that was more challenging, but we'll get there. So just to go over the structure, I think you know, as I mentioned before, it's very similar to a traditional vanilla bond where you have an issuer who is looking to raise capital, more related to project financing. And, you know, an investor is attracted to that issuance because of the coupon rate associated with it. The issuer is required to pay back that coupon rate and then the principal at the bond's maturity. There are a whole host of transaction costs that are associated with bonds in general, things like listing fees on stock exchanges, private placement, consulting fees, for example. But with green bonds, there's significantly more of that red tape. You know, initially there's a green bond framework that needs to be developed that communicates what the use of proceeds are for, or what are the funds within the green bond allocation for. And that needs to be either certified by a third party, or you need to have some kind of external verification associated with it. So things like a second opinion is what it's called in the market, is needed to float that bond. And to make sure that that investors gain the kind of confidence that they need in terms of its green integrity. And then you also need to observe the impact. So you are issuing a bond, but you are also, I use this term in quotes, but you know, you promise the investor that you are that they will gain some kind of impact associated with the funds that they support. So in a renewable energy bond, it would be percentage of renewable energy generated in kilowatt hours, for example, tons of emission reductions, etc. And I hope you can see that there is a lot of red tape. So I'm sure maybe the question from some of you is, why do we need oversight when we already have a green bond framework, a post-issuance report, a pre-issuance report, and then, you know, also some kind of third-party auditing of the entire process? And the problem is that a lot of the instruments and the way that they're presented are very narrative-based. And that means that there's often an issue in trying to get very specific information from the issuer and have some kind of certainty regarding those measurements. And that's some of where this issue of greenwashing comes to the fore. As I mentioned last week, greenwashing is when an entity may have unintended means for marketing a green instrument in a particular way, issuing a bond to market. A good example is maybe an oil and gas company that is issuing a green bond, which there is nothing that limits them. I think there's just the kind of market skepticism of why are they issuing a green bond when maybe their business is related to fossil fuels. So that is where some of this kind of greenwashing issues still arise, even though we have significant market regulation. So I mentioned this last week, and this is the last slide of kind of the recap. I mentioned about the explicit price benefits. Transaction costs are still a very significant barrier, and they limit a lot of issuances, specifically in emerging and developing markets. We do have donor agencies and multilateral development institutions trying to offset that cost. So sometimes you'll see GIZ, for example, offer a package to actually do the structuring, for example, and take on that cost of getting a green bond framework in place, having a second opinion done, etc. And then just to remind you that even though green bonds have been very useful in trying to mobilize the kind of capital that we need for green-related projects, they still are a very small fraction of the entire bond market. So we come to kind of why this project came about. And one of the real issues that I found kind of working in industry, specifically on the regulation side, is that even though a lot of green bond policies and regulation are in place, one of the real issues is the lack of non-compliance measures. And when I mean non-compliance measures, I'm specifically speaking about terms and conditions that you find in the green bond framework that mean that if an issuer does not do what they say they intend to do, so if they do not use the funds for renewable energy, then there can be some kind of consequences, legal consequences for the issuer. And you may ask, why is that not in place? Initially, when these instruments were coming on the market, a lot of it was trying to incentivize the market without trying to place too much of restriction. Obviously, the first bond issuance was in 2007, so it's been a long time since that first issuance. And the thinking has always been that issuers who generally will try and float a green bond will not really be interested in trying to not meet the requirements that they've set out in the green bond framework, because of kind of issues of transparency and not wanting to market themselves as an entity that is positively green and then not meeting those standards. So it was more of a kind of belief that issuers wouldn't do this. So there wasn't a need for specific non-compliance measures. I will say that there are some bonds that do have very specific non-compliance measures where, for example, there's a lot of transparency about how the use of proceeds are being used in real time. So in investor letters, for example, they are continuously updated to how funds are being spent, what type of projects it's flowing towards, and what kind of outcomes. So you do get those very rigorous types of bonds, but you also do not get, you also get some where there really are no legal consequences for issuers not doing the green that they are supposed to. Another issue is that when we have impact reporting, so when a bond has been floated, the issuer has received funds, they're implementing a project, the funds itself that are required to kind of undertake reporting on, so the impact associated with those funds, it is impossible to do that for the entire bond size. Sometimes it's, if you imagine a $500 million or $1 billion bond, it's impossible to do project level evaluations on those bonds. And that leads to this issue of cherry picking. So some issuers will focus on very specific projects, on very flagship projects, and only report on those. So there is a tendency for evaluations to focus on very specific sectors, and mostly this is related to renewable energy, and there are specific reasons for that. And I think that the lack of green bond transparency in general, if you had to think about this at a market level, one of the huge issues that often arises is that we can't really tell where the market is in terms of green finance as a whole. So even though we have bond issuances in South Africa that have been issued by the City of Johannesburg, City of Cape Town, a lot of the private banks, in totality, we can't really understand what are the green bond outcomes that are associated with those bonds relative to the entire market. And that is a big issue of effectiveness. So, are the funds that we're deploying for climate or green in general, are they making a difference? Or are they delivering the kind of project implementation that we want to see on the ground. So, and this kind of leads back to my issue of greenwashing earlier, where what you see is a lot of high-level reporting, a lot of focus on, we're doing X amount of volumes of bonds, but not really talking about how much are you actually delivering in terms of carbon emission reductions, water savings, even if you wanted to focus on water-related indicators. And that kind of transparency doesn't exist. I think it's a huge oversight in the market at the moment. But I think this is maybe just to give you some justification for why the study was undertaken in the way that it was. So, and last week we talked about different use cases, and this is the focus on a green bond regulation tool, where we're focusing on natural language processing and how it can be used. It's really on this sentiment analysis side. So if I had to distill it down to an aim, we're trying to assist financial regulators with benchmarking. And that is basically allowing regulators to understand what does a green bond, green integrity measure against what is best practice. So trying to compare a green bond to what is historically perceived to be best practice, to get an understanding of whether that measure is fair or not, and ultimately provide the investor with clarity about whether the green bond integrity is true or not. And I say investor, but really it's a tool that is envisioned to be used by the regulator who is sitting behind the issuances to get an understanding of whether the market is moving in the right direction. So this is kind of the overall research aim. I put automated tool because I think that was maybe the researcher in me, as I mentioned earlier, which was aspiring for this. But in reality, when I started to work with some of the data, it isn't going to be something that is going to be possible in the short term to be completely automated. So, and that's something, I think when you look at the data, and I'll present some later, I think the machine learning student in me wanted it to be something that was more automated, but it was just not possible. So this kind of leads to the methods of what I implemented. And there's two components. There's the text mining component, which is really trying to mine reports for extracting different pieces of evidence related to specific questions that can be answered about how far a green bond is pushing its limits in terms of delivering impact. And there are various different kinds of questions that one could frame. So, of course, in this way, the project is a little bit subjective initially because it requires a little bit of expert judgment on developing those questions in the first place. But to try and circumnavigate some of those issues, what I did was try and look at what certification standards are looking at as best practice for green bonds, and also some of the second opinion methods. So there's a little bit of expert judgment, but also a lot entrenched in the certification scores that were that are used in industry. Of course, large language models, even though they are useful, and I'm sure many of you have played around with things like ChatGPT's, OpenAI's ChatGPT, there's a huge issue of hallucination, as it's called. And this is, when you get false information from your LLM. And there are ways that you can constrain this information. So using text mining as the initial filter for the analysis was a useful way of directing the large language model on what is considered best practice. So in that way, you limit the amount of random language generation that comes through the model. Sometimes in some of the large language models, you can turn down certain parameters, things like temperature, where you can kind of set it to something that is completely deterministic based on what you feed in, to something very random if you are looking at developing an instrument that is, can be creative, that can use, a lot of random information from the built-in LLM itself. So of course, for this project, it was directed very much from the reports itself. And initially, it was used primarily as a way of mining the green bond reports themselves. Maybe the issue that I will just touch on is that, of course, when you're doing this for a set of 15 reports, it's very easy to use the ChatGPT, typical window that you would open up in your browser. But often, when you have large sets of data, like, for example, this paper has about 600 reports that are feeding into it, there is a need to kind of use the API to generate tokens and then generate the data sets based on the LLM and then do analysis on it. So, for smaller data sets, you could definitely play around with ChatGPT in this context. Just, pop in a green bond framework from the internet and you can see what it produces. But this is a little bit more structured in terms of what we tried to do in terms of the intended outcome. So this is just an overview of kind of the ML framework. It's very similar to ones that have been done in the climate finance space for things like climate-related financial disclosures or climate disclosures, where corporates are required to outline their exposure to physical risk, transition risk, etc. So very similar kind of thinking. It required us to first develop a set of benchmarking questions, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so having worked in industry, typically green bonds are focused on things like, are the sector use of proceeds communicated? So are you disclosing what sector allocations your funds are going towards? Do you have a robust framework for managing the funds? Are you outlining whether you have separate accounts available for the funds so that they do not mix with other non-green type of financial instruments? Do you have an impact officer who will be undertaking the impact analysis? Are you thinking about undertaking a second opinion or a CBI certification verification standard? These are types of questions that can be used to determine the green integrity of the green bond framework itself. Within the model itself, firstly, we built the model to try and extract from green bond impact reports and green bond frameworks. And this is another way of trying to safeguard the system itself, trying to look at what entities are communicating and then what they're communicating as impact. And the reason why we have both sets of information, it's almost a checks and balances kind of system where an entity would initially report what they intend to do, but the impact report is almost what they've already achieved. So those impact reports typically go to the investor. So we know that they are a representation of real outcomes, are not intended outcomes. So we use both sets of data. And initially what we try and do is mine those reports for answers to these specific benchmarking questions. Of course, there's a structured way to do that. So we need to be cognizant of taking down a lot of the metadata that's important. And again, this is important because, of hallucination. But often, with the training data set, there's a need to go back and look at the underlying data just to make sure that it is mining those reports in a correct way. We use, when we extract data from these reports, we don't take individual sentences, for example. We try and extract paragraphs where that sentence may be found that answers a particular benchmarking question, just to make sure that there's context around what is being said. A simple example could be something like, if you extract something about emissions and, you have a quantitative measure of emissions, and in the next sentence, it then goes on to say that those emissions have not yet been realized because the project is still in its construction phase. If you only take the single sentence, you only get that context of the emissions achieved. And the second sentence qualifies that by saying that actually those emissions have not yet been realized. So it's very important that you take these kind of contextual clues so that when you do the assessment of the training data set, that you can make sure that it's robust and replicable. Things like flags are quite important. So just making sure that you tell the model that when it's not sure, that it doesn't generate anything by itself, that it generates an unsure or question mark, so that you can kind of have that as context, that there are certain questions that are not answered, and that you're not getting a jargon into the model. So I mentioned two things there, the training and testing data set. The training data set was again used from expert knowledge to try and understand what is considered a best practice report, or what is considered a strong green bond framework, a green bond impact report. And these reports were then used as the kind of benchmark for testing how other reports would measure against it. Once the scraped data is put into the LLM, we then run something called query and retrieve. So you try and use the extracted data from the report to then answer specific questions about performance. So an example of this could be if you wanted to speak about the emission reductions related to renewable energy, you could ask whether these emissions are associated with scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3. So scope 1 and scope 2 is a better indicator of owned emissions, and that maybe gives you a better indication of whether the entity itself is reducing emissions, or whether it's the suppliers or their supply chain that is removing those emissions. And it just gives you a better idea about whether those whether those indicators of green integrity are true or not. And based on that, we provide a score of yes or no. So of course, within the training data set, we have we have different reports that are pulling through that kind of show best practice, but they also show instances where best practice is not present, to try and give the model balance in trying to identify issues that would arise in how a green bond impact report is disclosed. And maybe just to give you one last example of that, sometimes in green bond reports, there's a lot of focus on narrative-based information. So a lot of talking about what we intend to do, what types of sectors, you often see things like, community leadership, strategic direction, a lot of jargon words, and it really comes through in the model itself, but very little talk about actually what is being achieved in quantitative numbers. And even in qualitative terms, for example, you can still get an indicator of qualitative metrics in a robust way. So even some of that jargon gets picked up by the model, and you can definitely see that in the changes in the scoring scale. Yeah, so I hope this gives you maybe, I'm just going to check the chatting because I've popped it on nothing. I hope this gives you a bit of an example of how the model was generated and maybe the workflow. Of course, there's a lot of different elements to this, and there's a lot of submodels and programs that were developed to try and mine. I put down a web scraping algorithm because a lot of these green bond reports are publicly available, but because there's so many, we had to automate the process by using Google's API to search, in an automated way. So to mine them. So there's a lot of kind of sub programs, but I'm happy to talk in detail when we get through to Q&A. I'm just checking the times to make sure I'm not going over time. Okay. So this is kind of what some of the outputs look like. And this is just one report that we generated questions for. And this is for a Norwegian tax authority issuer. And this is kind of some of the information that can be mined. If you have to look at some of the questions that we propose, so things like, are project use of proceeds clearly communicated? And it provides the source, which is quite important. It gives you an indication of high, whether it's relevant or not. I will point out here that this is the column, the relevance column is something that you need to check. And that's where that's the column that we primarily use for training, because that's the column that will determine, whether the model is, whether it's being trained correctly or whether it's kind of accounting for that context and making decisions of relevance that make sense. And then, you can expand this as much as you want. I've seen cases where there's a lot of supplemental information that comes with this. But this is just maybe a snapshot of exactly what some of the outputs would be from the model itself. One of the huge issues with this project is that we don't have green bond issuances that are the green bond market, or what is available in terms of publicly disclosed information, is varied by financial actor or issuer type and region. And it's one of the huge issues that I found where, some of the African sensitive green bonds were very difficult to determine in terms of performance, because you had 12 cases to work with, given some of the issuances on the continent. So maybe just to have that context in the back of your mind, that even though the accuracy of the model when using different machine learning techniques, 74% looks okay. The truth is, it's probably a little lower than that if you have to account for some of the context issues and some of the issues that arise in different regions and between different financial actors. It's a little bit lower. And this kind of leads me to the conclusion that it cannot be fully automated at the moment because the sample size is just too low. Yeah, so I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea about some of the overall findings that were achieved from the report. And, this use case is obviously for green bonds, but I've seen this being used for national adaptation plans, NDCs, to try and get an understanding under the UNFCCC how we're progressing towards the Paris Agreement. I mentioned earlier how the financial sector is disclosing climate risk. So there are many structures that this type of LLM use case can fit into. So maybe just to keep that in mind, this is just the green bond application of it. So just to sum up the conclusions, I think one of the frustrating issues with this project is that the training data set, or the ability to create a quality data set, um, is something that limits the model incredibly. And when you look at the different types of model simulations that we ran, you get, I mean, I say it varies between 0 and 55 to 65, and those are the models that we took through to the final evaluation. But in some cases, we had instances where it was about, 0.4. So, 40% accuracy, not great, and of course not, therefore not being able to apply something like this in industry, just because it's not robust enough, and there's deep inaccuracies. However, when the right benchmarking questions were used, and when we had better training data set reports, so better use cases of what constitutes best practice, the model did improve. However, I mentioned it before, there is still a degree of hallucination that is detected within this model. So with several, because I've written some of the Green Bond framework, in some ways I was minding my own reports, and I could see how it kind of changes the language. And in some cases, that language makes things seem in a more positive light than they are. And having written them, I was writing it as a person who wasn't convinced about the environmental integrity, and because of the hallucination in the model, it kind of changed some of that language and made it seem a lot more positive. So there are these issues that creep into the model, and that's why going back and making sure that the training data set is really robust was quite critical. I mentioned the issue with African green bonds, but it also arises in different sector types. So with resilience and adaptation, we have less bonds that you would qualify as adaptation and resilience focused. And that really caused a problem in trying to get those bonds to be benchmarked. In some cases, they just weren't possible. So in some of the models, we actually exclude them completely and try and just focus on mitigation sectors, which of course is an acknowledged issue. But of course, this is trying to create something for the future, and it doesn't have to be perfect at the moment. Some of the underlying methodologies did assist the model in reducing the hallucination, but also trying to improve the model accuracy. So the sentence chunking and taking larger paragraph sizes, trying to look at paragraphs before and after key statements, help the model improve in terms of its scoring. I think one of the major issues across the market is that if you have cherry picking within the reports themselves, then that information filters through to your training data set. So you already start off with a skewed data set, which is problematic. And also this relates to impact metrics. So if you don't have impact metrics being communicated in robust methodologies within the reports, then ultimately that is not taken into account within the training data set. And it then becomes very difficult to benchmark others that are doing this in the future. So I hope it gives you an idea of how, sometimes what is currently best practice may not be best practice in the future, but it also makes it very difficult to make an assessment of how to create a training data set that's robust. I also mentioned renewable energy, and that you tend to get cherry picking on specific sectors, and renewable energy is definitely one of them, where you see large focus on it. And the focus of this is very, very much because the quantification of the impacts is significantly easier. Trying to create a counterfactual between a renewable energy plant being present or not, and then measuring the emission reductions is easier they're doing something like biodiversity, where it is a nightmare, quite frankly. And then lastly, just to maybe to conclude before we go to Q&A and some feedback, that even though it started off as, maybe ambitious to try and think that it could be automated, the overall conclusion is that it still is useful, but it is useful as a decision support tool and not a decision-making tool. So I've heard that phrase being coined in several talks, but I think this definitely hits home with this kind of tool where there is still a need for human capacity behind some of these machine learning models that can decipher whether something is best practice or not, adjusting benchmarking questions, for example, to make sure that the model is predicting in the way that we'd like. And therefore, in the short term, it's likely that it won't be fully automated or possible to be fully automated, and that it will require expert judgment into the future as we go forward. So that's all I have for you today. I hope that the series as a whole has been helpful for you to try and understand some of the different applications, just what is maybe being done in the field itself. And then just to give you an idea about how machine learning could be used as well in the future with other use cases in climate finance. But I'll stop there, and then hopefully we can get some Q&A, and you can ask me some questions about what I did, and if you need any further clarity. Okay. Okay, does anybody want to ask any questions? I'm happy to unmute you when you do raise your hand. No need to be shy. So anybody with any, Emmanuel, I'm going to allow you to talk and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Emmanuel, can you just say that again?
Yeah, I just want to find out.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, these things are for big scale projects, but what about small scale projects like farming?
Yes.
Where you have to install solar, PV solar on top of the roof and get some credit for it. So are these applicable to those small projects?
Yeah, I don't know if a lot of these project types are not really financed within green bonds. I can maybe talk about an application where I know that it is being used in that way. There is a case where a geospatial system is being used to detect solar panels on rooftop solar to get an understanding of whether an insurer needs to pay out because of damage. So I have seen it being used in that context. But in terms of this project, in terms of green bond frameworks itself, a lot of the individual project types are not communicated in the green bond framework. And it's a noticeable deficiency with how issuers report. Some of them only report at the sectoral level and don't really report at the activity level. So even though it is possible that the use of proceeds could be used for these project types, often an issuer will not disclose exactly how they plan to use their proceeds. You do get certain green bonds where it is communicated very clearly. So the City of Cape Town's green bond is a good example of that, where they went down to a very downscale level, talking about things like water-saving technologies on taps and shower heads, for example, as being part of the activities that they would finance. But in reality, there's nothing that stops an entity from limiting how detailed their reporting is. And that causes a problem with the system being able to identify the specific activities. I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea about how.
Okay, I can realize it's at a macro level, it's not at a micro scale.
It depends. It depends on whether the reporting entities can report at that level. So it is possible that you could go down to a micro scale, but you would need to use a training data set of green bond issuances where they're very detailed. And maybe just from kind of looking at the varied types, you would probably have to look at public sector green bond issuances. Typically, those bond issuances have very detailed use of proceeds communications, and it's most likely because it's a public sector entity and there is a need for clarity given that the use of proceeds is going towards public goods. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay. I'm just going to look in the chat if there's nothing there. No. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that is all that we'll go through today. But just to maybe lastly communicate. Firstly, if you have any other questions, you're always welcome to email me. Just put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to kind of speak more about the topics. I think even though we had 4 sessions and there were probably a lot of information that I've thrown towards you. There's a whole host of other use cases that we haven't gone into. So there's always a willingness to kind of speak about other applications. And I know I've gotten emails from some of you regarding supervision and that kind of thing. So happy to speak about that in future. And then secondly, just to thank you for attending and your attention during the weeks. It's really been really interesting within the webinars itself, but also offline to get some of the communication from you regarding some of the work that you're doing, and also trying to get clarification about how it could be improved or how you could integrate different methods. So I think that's all from me, and just thank you for your time, and I hope that you join for future research mini schools. I think the next one that will be focused on that I'll be doing probably later in the year is more focused on climate modeling and machine learning. So stay tuned for that.